standardized regulatory review process. I think everybody, and this has been quite a number of years. I think everybody who has been following the FDA or who's been working with the FDA knows that this has started 2 decades ago, really, that we started trying to move towards more consistent data. You can see from the timeline here that we really started in the 90s, in the late 90s, collaborating with industry, standardizing electronic and moving to electronic study data. So study data comprises a big part of the data that's considered in new drug applications, and that's the reason why we're trying to take such an effort here to bring this stuff in electronically. I apologize a little bit because I'm a little discombobulated from all that telephone problem too. So I'm moving a little bit slowly. We expect that now we're already realizing the value in study data from the electronic data that we're receiving right now. That's standardized. We expect, though, that this value proposition is not going to be fully realized for a number of years because, of course, studies take a number of years to be accomplished, and that subsequent data, the bolus of data that we receive, we're not going to go back. We don't expect to be going back and retroactively standardizing data that we receive. So the bolus of data that we receive moving forward is going to really show us the value that we're anticipating from this. We believe that all of our partners in this are anticipating the same thing. It'll certainly improve consistency, predictability, and traceability. It enables us to develop tools. It enables our analysts to use advanced analytic tools for their analyses and for their meta-analyses. It allows us to pool, and since we're in such a global environment when it comes to drug development and regulatory process, it facilitates and enables us to share data or to collaborate and understand one another across regulatory authorities around the globe. So if you fast forward to 2012, and the enactment of FDASIA, the FDA Science and Innovation Act, and PDUFA 5, you would see that we have in PDUFA 5, we agreed with industry that FDA and industry would take this all a step further, and that we would try to further develop and implement electronic standards for new drug review, and to require standardized submissions of data electronically through binding guidance, which is very new. At the end of 2014, as a matter of fact, we published our final binding guidance for clinical and non-clinical study data, which is going to be the topic, as I said earlier, of today's webinar. We are seeing return. Okay. We're seeing increasing numbers of submissions with CDISC SDTM data sets in them now, as you can see on this slide. It's obviously a long way to go, but we've made some good progress. Now, the challenge here with this slide is that not all of the, when it says 69% of submissions with study data come in and have some kind of CDISC SDTM, sometimes it's study data structure that resembles SDTM, so it's not really standardized. We're not really introducing the full consistency that we're looking for, but you can see progress. You can see it moving forward, and this is just over the past couple of years. If we go back further, you could see a consistent and a corresponding increase. So we're very hopeful, and as I said earlier, we have actually been able to start using this data and realizing the value out of that already. And if we could go to the next slide, please. Okay. So in December, as I said, the final FDASIA and e-study data binding guidances were published. Binding meaning that, in fact, contrary to what we have always known and understood with traditional guidance, that these are recommendations, they're encouragements, but they're not requirements. Binding guidance actually is required, and it's got a very specific specific set of things that can be required through binding guidance, electronic study data being one of those. So these things were published, and the data standards catalog was published that lists standards that are currently accepted and setting the stage for requiring standardized electronic study data. Also recently published is a traditional guidance document on technical conformance for submissions so that people understand how to actually comply with this and send in a successful submission. So at this point, I'm going to hand the baton over to my colleague, Ron Fitzmartin, and Ron is going to walk you through these guidances and how to interpret and use them for regulatory submissions.
Good morning, everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties, and sorry for those who cannot log on. We probably should have had a higher limit on the logins, but for those that are on the line, we'll go through these slides and certainly we'll make them available. And as Marianne said, perhaps we'll schedule another webinar soon. So what I'm going to do today is go through at a fairly high level each document and just to give an overview on our thinking as we prepared the e-study guidance, the FDASIA guidance and the e-study guidance, and as well as the technical conformance guide. So the FDASIA guidance should be looked at as the implementation guidance. It is a binding guidance, but it is a framework for how submissions will be sent to the FDA in electronic format. What is important about this particular guidance is that it specifies that there will be individual guidances prepared. It is those individual guidances such as the standardized study data guidance that has the important components in it for that particular content area. For instance, it'll talk about the submission types, it'll talk about a timetable for implementation, it'll talk about the actual content and what that format is. So when study data standards will be required. So now we can say definitively, because we published the final guidance in December of last year, that the clock has started. So 24 months, December 2016, studies that start after that time frame must use the standards in the data standards catalog that Marianne mentioned. It's 36 months for INDs. So the clock has started, and 24 months from now, all studies that start after December of 2016 must use the standards that are listed in the data standards catalogs for NDAs, ANDAs, BLAs, and 36 months for INDs. So what are the data standards, study data standards that will be required? Okay, so we have the guidance that was published, final. In 2016, the data standards catalog that exists now will list those standards and it will list a requirement date. And here's a screenshot. You could go to the website right now and take a look at this version 4.0. You see that there's columns that say date requirement begins, date requirement ends. We will be updating this catalog with the next version probably by the end of the week or top of next. And those columns for the appropriate standards the requirement date will be listed there. So how study data standards will be required? Well, many of you know of prior documents such as the CDISC Data Standards Common Issues document and the Study Data Specification document. Those now have been retired. So now that we have the Technical Conformance Guide, which is a non-binding guide, it replaces those two documents. We are now in version 2.0. We plan on issuing a version update probably in the next month or two to add some, clarify some issues that we received from externally and from discussions we've had internally. And you see some of the sections within that Technical Conformance Guide. It's pretty comprehensive and covers a lot of CDISC standards, terminology, data conversion recommendations, and a bit on electronic submission format. So timetable. Some of this looks like it didn't transfer into Adobe correctly, but we'll go through it anyway. So the e-study guidance talks about a transition date. Some folks are thinking that the transition date is a requirement date. Transition date is just what it is. It's a transition for implementation of a particular standard. It's not a requirement date. Moving to the right, we wanted to make this as easy as it could be, so we've used a date, a fixed calendar month and day, March 15th. So the transition date will always be the next March 15th following an FR notice, FRN, that announces a new standard or a version update. So here's an example. So if we issued a FR notice for a new standard on September 5, 2018, the transition date would be the following March 15th of 2019. So we would fast forward to 2019 in the March 15 of that year. So in many cases, we're looking at a long implementation period to give industry as long as possible to ramp up for a new standard. So if the transition date then is March 15, 2019, because this is a new study data standard, submissions, so the requirement date becomes March 15, 2021. So studies that start 2 years after the transition date will need to use that new standard. Okay. Now, for version updates, this is an example that comes, is taken right from the guidance itself. And we just highlighted one of the examples there on an SDTM hypothetical 4.1, where in this case, it would be CDISC that would release that new update to SDTM on February 15th, 2016. We would then determine internally whether we can support that new version update, go through a process. We would issue a Federal Register notice announcing that we, in fact, can support that new SDTM update on May 6th, 2016. So we would update the data standards catalog, at that point in time of May 6, 2016. However, since the March 15th date is after the May 6, 2016, it would go into the next calendar year, and the transition date becomes March 15, 2017. And the requirement date for version updates is a 12-month after transition, so that would be March 15th, 2018. So required in submissions for studies that start 12 months after the transition date, or in this particular example, March 15, 2018. So, are there waivers? There are no waivers from the requirement to submit standardized study data. You could apply for a waiver to submit in a standard, a previously supported standard, but there's no waivers from the requirement to submit from standardized study data. Are there exemptions from the requirement? Yes, there are exemptions from the requirement. So, for instance, non-commercial INDs are exempted, and certain submissions to CBER that are submitted as devices are exempted from the requirement. Okay. Can FDA refuse to file, or in the case of ANDAs, refuse to receive? Yes. So the guidance clearly states that FDA can do that. However, we don't want to do that, certainly for standardized study data. So it will be our effort to look at the submission when it comes through the gateway and make a determination on whether the submission can be processed early on and not as it's moved towards to the division. So that process and those criteria are now being discussed internally. So we thought we would put together some frequently asked questions. So when does all this start? We'll take some questions at the end, as many as we can. We'll just fire through these. There's only a few more slides. The clock has started. Clinical and non-clinical studies, that's important that this guidance does include non-clinical studies. So SEND, the SEND standard is included in this. There were some questions about that. That start after December 17, 2016, must use the standards in the catalog. Can sponsors use the standards in the data catalog now? Yes, we strongly encourage you to do so. Of course, many sponsors have been using those standards in the catalog for many years now. How often will FDA update the data catalog? So new versions or new standards will be posted to the data catalog. A Federal Register notice will accompany all updates. Identified errata will be corrected as needed. What is the transition date? I mentioned that just a bit ago. It's always March 15th and always the March 15th following the Federal Register notice. It is used to determine the requirement date. And what is a requirement date? It's 24 months after the transition date for a new standard and 12 months after the transition date for a version update. How does the FDA determine that a version update or a new standard can be supported? We have a process that is executed to evaluate if we can process, review, and archive a new update or standard. And that's what we use. And a couple more. Is there a limit to what can be required under FDASIA 745A? So the regulatory answer to this is typo there. Any data/information that is determined to be part of a submission under subsection BIJ of section 505 of the FD&C Act may be within scope. So there could be a number of, as I said, these individual guidances coming out that fall under FDASIA 745A little a. Are the recommendations in the conformance guide required? No. It's a non-binding guide, but we encourage sponsors to submit using the recommendations in the guide. How often will there be updates to the conformance guide? Generally, we will provide updates on an annual basis or more frequently for hot topics. If there's information that we need to get out there to industry, we certainly will consider a more frequent issue of the guide. Does FDASIA 745A, little a, only apply to study data? No, there will be additional binding guidance issued. For example, the ECTD guidance will be issued as a final binding guidance, most likely later this year. Are there validation rules for SDTM and SEND data sets? Yes, I think many of you on the line are aware that the Study Data Standards Resources webpage provides access to those rules. And just some support. If you go to the FDA webpage, there's a lot of information and links to these documents. Many take advantage of the eData team. There's the web address is listed there to ask questions about standards related issues. For electronic submissions, there's the eSubs email address, and maybe a little difficult to see, but there's a number of groups: CDER, Office of Computational Science, our group, CDER, Office of Strategic Programs, the Data Standards Program, and CDER's Office of Business Informatics, the eData team, provide much support for data standards. And I think the last thing I have here is, if I can get this to click. So on the, you see the link there, if you can. This page says you could submit a sample ECTD or standardized study data sample to the FDA. So we would take a look at it to see how well it conforms to standards. So we highly encourage you to take advantage of this, this support. I think that might be it. And we mentioned these references throughout the presentation, and I think that's it. Thank you.
So we do have, excuse me, we do have a few questions here. The first one is, what is an FRN? It's actually a Federal Register notice. It's our way of formally notifying any interested stakeholders of an action or some activity or some piece of information. Okay. I've been told to speak up. I apologize. And I can't quite see the entire question on this next one. The second one, yes. Okay, hold on just a moment. Yes, so I'm just reading this. The question is, as of December 2016, study data must start using new standards. So realistically, the submission with these studies will be CDISC later than 2016. Is this the correct assumption? Well, it will be, yes, it will be studies that start after the require by date. There's a, in the FDUFA 5 commitment letter, you can find the specifics, but it would be studies that start after the 2016 date that these standards will be required. And the data standards catalog includes the dates for each type of standard and what the requirement by date would be. And I hope that that answers it. If not, please feel free to send another question in to our e-team or the e-sub email address, and we'll endeavor to answer it in more detail. And then the next one is, what about studies started prior to December 2016? No, we are not expecting to require any conversions for submissions after 2016 if those studies started prior to that date. Okay, next one. GLP studies. So the question is, do these requirements apply to GLP studies only or to early non-GLP studies? Ron.
Yeah, we've had a number of questions about this. The guidance does not discuss non-GLP studies, and any submission under to FDA under 745A will be required to submit using standardized study data, whether it's GLP or non-GLP.
So Gary has asked, will who drug be added for code and convents for clinical study data? Well, I think you'll be seeing that coming out very shortly in an FR notice that yes, we'll be accepting, formally recognizing that we accept these. Will they be required? I don't know that I have the answer for that, but we certainly accept and expect them now. Okay, so next, how are sponsors expected to combine all data from different CROs that may use different electronic providers for send? If sponsors are very small companies, how do they do the physical combining of these files? I'm not sure. This might be something that we'll need to have a conversation about, and I would request that you send this into the eSub email address. But I guess what I could say to you now is that we are expecting, because the timeline is so far out, that studies that start after the requirement date will all be using SEND as its as part of the study in capturing the data from the study, and so there wouldn't be a combination issue. And then the next question here is, did you mention that medical devices are exempted? Are these diagnostic devices or all medical devices, including microsphere?
It's only devices, and it's laid out in the guidance, devices that are regulated by CBER. So BLAs that are devices regulated by CBER are exempted.
Now, that is not to imply that devices that are being this required by the requirement is a CDRH requirement too, because that's not the case. CDRH has not yet considered this thoroughly yet.
Right. This is a binding guidance for CDER and CBER only.
Exactly. So are government-sponsored studies, e.g. NCI-sponsored, considered non-commercial? Generally, anything that is intended, yes. Generally, anything that is intended to ultimately end up in an NDA or a BLA is considered commercial, and others are non-commercial. Will the SEND data sets for non-clinical studies apply to all studies or just carcinogenicity studies?
Well, it's the SEND standard only applies to what is available within SEND. Right now, I believe there's only 2 domains, so those domains would be required.
How can we assure when a study will begin, given that it's based on enrollment in the study? CRF design begins at least 6 months prior to enrollment. I'm not sure that I understand the question, but I'll take a crack at this. The requirement, Ron might have some.
Right. So the study start date, and that's specified in the guidance. It's the informed consent. It's the study start date variable that's in both the SEND and in the SDTM standards. That would be the first instance of a patient's informed consent. I believe the actual definition is specified in the guidance on page 5. It is the study start date for clinical studies is the earliest date of informed consent among any subject that enrolled in the study.
I'm seeing a fair number of comments and notes that you were not able to hear, or maybe you still are not able to hear us well. We'll be publishing this, and we will, in all likelihood, be doing another webinar for this since we had some challenges here. So no worries if if you're missing some pieces here. In the meantime, let me see the technical conformance guide. Section 8322, fourth bullet, legacy data may be needed in addition to the converted data. SDS is now deprecated. What are the organization and publishing standards for legacy data?
Well, I'm not sure what the question is asking, but the legacy data may be required. Many companies are converting to SDTM late in the stage of prior to submitting to the FDA, and so that kind of breaks the chain for traceability. So if the analysis is done with legacy data sets, and at the end, just prior to submission, you convert your database into SDTM, it's not easy for the reviewers, specifically the statistical reviewers, to trace back. So it's easier for them. They would more than likely want the data that was used for analysis as well. So the need for both legacy and the converted data may be needed. And that's why that section specifies that. Can you clarify? Okay. Oh.
Well, so the question is, can you please clarify 745A? 745A is part of the Code of Federal Regulation. That is the modification, or in 745A, in that section in the CFR, is the modification that was caused by the FDA Science and Innovation Act, the wording in the FDASIA. Is it acceptable to have a mix of data standards in the submission, provided that each individual study meets the standard applicable to that study? The answer is yes.
Right. And the important word there is in the submission. So certainly submissions contain studies that go across many years. So it's more than likely that you will have perhaps two different versions of a standard used, but not within a study. How can you share that? Oh, yeah, we did that. Yeah.
So the question, can you re-explain what you said about criteria for refusing to receive submissions? We're not intending that. Essentially, in a nutshell, what Ron was saying is that we're not giving out. We're not going to be able to give waivers for submitting in a standard. We expect the submissions in a standard, in the specified standard. What we can do, so we won't waive the standard entirely. What we can do, though, when it warrants it, is to provide a waiver for the need to submit a submission in the current standard, to be able to use an older standard if that's what your study started with or what have you. And I see another question. A lot of older studies may be only available in paper. Is this an issue? No, this is not an issue. We're not going to go back and ask people to convert old stuff. I'd like to ask, it's a little late in the game, well, it's really late in the game, but I'd like to ask anybody to just send a note and let me know if you can hear me now or if this was an older problem. In the meantime, can there be different versions of define.xmls across a submission? That is, some studies in a submission use define.xml 1.0 while others use 2.0.
Yeah, the answer is yes.
And thank you very much. I couldn't get any closer to the mic. That's what I was hoping. Oh, should sponsors submit data in SDTM format before December 2016? Well, we would be delighted to receive it. You're not required, but we'd love to. And yes, you will get the slides. They'll be published. Will the Technical Conformance Guide provide templates for the data standardization plan?
Yeah. So we're working on a set of recommendations for what that plan would look like, and you should be seeing a Federal Register notice sometime in the near future providing a bit more detail on what our expectations would be.
Will send data be required to be QA'd against the raw data as per GLPs? I'm afraid I don't have an answer for that. Honestly, we'll take that back. So SDS provided the framework for how to submit legacy standards, i.e. key variable, sort order, etc. Now that SDS is no longer in effect, what should we be using for guidance on how to organize and submit the legacy data?
I would use the Technical Conformance Guide in Section 8. It provides some recommendations on how data should be submitted if it is converted. But there is no, we're talking about standardized study data now. We are not encouraging the submission of legacy data. And I mean, to say that there's legacy standards, I don't know what that really means. Certainly there's legacy standards within a company, but we want to see the CDISC, SDTM, ATOM, and SEND data submitted to us. And as I said earlier, there may be need for the legacy data to be submitted only because of the way the SDTM structure was created. If it was created at the end of the process, the data management process, and prior to submission, then the traceability back to the case report form is very difficult. So the legacy data would be needed. We got that one. Let's go back to the top.
So this says, when studies are submitted, is it expected that all studies included in submission will be all in compliance with only one CDISC CT list?
Oh, yeah. So we certainly understand it all depends upon the timing, right? So studies that are we're talking about studies in the future that start, right? Based on the requirement date. So we expect that there'll be a period of time where there'll be studies submitted that are not in conformance with the standards until we get to that place. We're going to expect to see legacy data coming in. This one.
So this, in terms of a non-GLP question, it's not clear to me what you meant by under 745A. That is the guidance that does not talk about it. Well, I think the thing about 745A is that that's the regulation. And so the PDUFA and FDASIA are more specific. 745A, the CFR it has distilled it down to just the small piece that needs to be in the code. And I'm going to let Ron expand on that if it is.
Yeah, so the question on GLP, we do not distinguish between GLP and non-GLP studies. So we're getting that question quite a bit. It's information and data that fall under 745A sub A of FD&C Act. And if they're in it's information that is submitted under 505B, then those data are required to follow, are required to conform to the standards. There is no distinguishing between GLP or non-GLP studies.
So this says you mentioned that sample ECTD and data standards can be sent to the agency. It's a two-part question. First, where do we send the information? And second, can we do this proactively in 2015? Certainly you can do this proactively. And sending sample ECTD and standards into the agency can go to, good question,
Right.
do we want it to us?
Well, if you go, I understand that perhaps that link may not been correct that was on the slide, but if you go to that web page, if you find that web page, you'll see the process for contacting the eSubs team, I believe, and they could direct you, or you could send an email to the eData team or the eSubs team, and we could provide you with the information on what the process would be. So I would say, yeah, we encourage you to do that now.
Okay, there's a suggestion that all amendments to INDs and NDAs have to have all of their study data provided electronically, even if they weren't originally required in that form. That suggests studies started earlier than the required date in 2016 would need converting. No, that's not the intention. Do these binding guidances apply to stability data that are sometimes included in Module 3? So right now it applies to study data, any kind of study data. We are, I can tell you, looking at electronic standards for other types of data. My question is in relation to CSR section 16.4, individual patient data listings. ICH E3 guidance listed out annexes which should be provided as tables. However, ECTD comprehensive table of content headings and hierarchy module 5.3.5.3 listed out analysis information. Can you recommend what we should follow for the CSR? I suggest that you email the eSub team and we will research that and get back to you. We're just going through and looking for questions that we haven't addressed. I'm sure we'll miss some too. My apologies in advance. If we do miss your question, please send it in to us on the eData or the eSub email address. Is there a standard for clinical observations for non-clinical studies like there are standards for pathology?
Send an email to. I would. I don't know that answer. I would send an email to the eData team, and we will get you the answer.
Someone asked when this will be rescheduled. We can't answer that yet. It really depends on availability of the room and the AV equipment. But we'll try to make it soon. Is it acceptable to include a preclinical study in an unsupported send version in a submission many years later?
Yeah, sure. Depends upon when it was started. If it's an old study, then sure. We expect that that's going to happen for a number of years.
If you have a long duration study and there are updates, I assume, to the standard, must the data be updated to the current version at the end of the study? No, that's actually the key reason for having the ability to provide waivers to use an older version of the standard. We don't want to force conversions.
Right. And so, many companies do up version. That's a business decision, whether you up version during the course of a trial. If there's a new version and before you close the database out, you up version. That's your decision. Many companies, not talking about CDISC standards, but just looking at MEDRA, many companies will up version their adverse event database with the newest version prior to database lock. And some companies up version for the ISS. So, but that would be your decision. There's a discussion on that in the technical conformance guide with respect to terminology. So I would encourage you to take a look at that.
Does FDA require to have the standard to SDTM and ATOM data sets for the pharmacokinetic and endpoint bioequivalence studies, or just the SAS transport files, which we've been providing are adequate for these bioequivalence studies?
So the short answer to that is that those two domains, pharmacokinetic domains in SDTM, are part of the standard and will be required. You already did that?
Yeah.
I already did that. Which one? This one?
Yeah. Is the definition of legacy data any study that started before December 17th, 2016?
No.
Well, no. The definition of legacy data
It's non-standard.
is any data that's not following standard. Oh, misinterpretations. I've heard misinterpretations that FDA expects fully electronic trial master files in 2016. Can you clarify?
The final guidance on ECTD will be published, like I said, sometime this year. So that will go into, will specify that particular point. So we're not prepared to discuss that at this point because that's still a draft guidance.
There are quite a few very small labs that record data manually, including bioanalytical labs. Would these small labs be required to convert to electronic systems? Well, I guess the answer to that is either they're converting to electronic systems or the sponsors submitting for them are converting, making the data electronic. Because we really don't have a waiver to submitting electronic and standardized. Oh.
So if we submit both split and non-split data sets, which data sets are documented in the define.xml document? So we've received that question, I think recently, through the eData team. I don't know whether we've discussed it and came up with a response to that. But if we have not, we soon will have a response. If you didn't, I won't name the name, but if you didn't, the person who submitted this question today, if you didn't submit through the eData team, please do, because the responses that we send back only go to the submitter. So we encourage you to submit this question to the eData team.
How should the industry submit study data for endpoints that hasn't been modeled in SDTM or SEND yet for studies where the rest of the data is in scope for SDTM or SEND? Honestly, I'm not sure I understand that. I apologize. I would ask if you could just send this in to eData, or maybe Ron has got some thoughts.
Yeah. So I guess the way I'm taking this is you're talking about endpoints. So if we all know that many efficacy endpoints are not standardized, so we're working, as many of you know online, we're working in the area of standardizing therapeutic area endpoints, and those are now being released by CDISC. So if FDA currently doesn't support a particular therapeutic area with respect to endpoints, then you would submit as you currently are submitting those endpoints. They would not be reflected with any CDISC standard, using any CDISC standard. Good question.
That is a good question, and I apologize. As soon as Ron started talking, I knew how to interpret it. Thank you, Ron. Okay, we are in the API business. New data generated at and after requirement date should be submitted following the new guide. But what about the part done before the requirement date, that we may have different submission formats for the same product? Yeah, are we?
So, assuming we're talking about, it says we're in the API business, active pharmaceutical ingredient, I assume that that's what is referenced there. I don't understand whether if this question applies to study data, clinical and non-clinical study data. If it refers to just API data, that would not, the e-study guidance would not pertain to API. So we would need, if you can clarify that question a bit more and send it to the eData team, we could take a look at it.
Provide a more detailed answer. So this one says, we see work progressing on therapeutic area standards, but nothing is yet reflected in FDA's data standards catalog. Do you anticipate starting to recommend or require any TA standards soon? As a matter of fact, we do. We have an effort underway in this fiscal year to run through our acceptance and readiness testing on quite a number of these that have been getting worked on, so you should see some updates soon. Would you please publish a frequently asked questions and answers in the FDA resource website? Great request. We've been looking at this and trying to come up to a way to do this for some time, and it's been taking a backseat here lately, but this is something that we've been actively considering.
So yeah, we certainly want to do this. We have to find a vehicle to do this. In discussing with our policy experts, a FAQ list could be interpreted as guidance, and it would have to follow the proper channels for good guidance practices. So we're still trying to figure out how we can get this information to you. I think many of us agree that using the technical conformance guide is probably the best place to put some of this information, because as a document that's really attached to the e-study guidance, we can publish that more frequently to the website than we can trying to create an FAQ list. But we're trying. Think so? Okay.
So if not already answered, when will the column date requirement begins be populated in the data standards catalog for the current versions of CDISC standards?
By the end of the week or talking next?
In the next couple of weeks.
Party over. Alrighty.
What can we say about the dataset.xml standard? Well, as you know, we have undergone a test of that, and I believe that we're in the middle of writing our final report, the test results now. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And so that should be published in the near future. So is it okay to submit the following data standards for studies that start before December 2016? First, CDISC part, all raw data in SDTM and in ADSL. And the second part, all data in legacy format. Would this confuse the FDA reviewers, as there might be duplicated information?
I think that happens now.
I think that does happen now, and I think that as long as there is some accompaniment that clarifies what they're receiving, that would be fine.
Right. So you could document that in the Study Data Reviewers Guide and the Analysis Data Reviewers Guide.
This question, did I understand correctly that studies started after 2018 would need to meet the SEND requirements?
Studies that start after 2016.
Yes, after 2016. We're looking for more. Okay, can the response from the eData team be available to the public? Well, that's our challenge that Ron was just talking about with publishing an FAQ. We're very interested in doing that, and we're working to find a way. And at the moment, our mechanism has been, our medium has been the technical conformance guide. Next, I would like to see an example. Hang on a moment. I would like to see an example of an IND NDA submission with the proposed data standards. We're anxious to get them in. You know, this probably would warrant a little bit more clarification. What specifically would help you if you would send a note into the eData team or the eSub team, we can follow up on that separately. Okay, for drug device combination products, is it possible to have non-conformance data for the device portion in the submission?
Wow.
I'm not sure how to answer that. Again, I would ask you if you could just send that in to us separately. We'll follow up with the appropriate people in the centers to find out. Okay, a study in an SDTM version that is expired. Can this be submitted, or does it have to be upgraded to a supported version? What we would want is to get a request from you and be able to review and determine if we could do that and provide a waiver.
Right.
But unless it's just absolutely necessary, we're not going to require you to upgrade. We have a few phase 1 studies that were not in SDTM format. The CSRs have been issued. Can we submit these data in the legacy or non-standard format? Yes. The answer is yes. We got this one again. There's a question here. What version of the Phoenix Win non-Lin FDA is using? I'm afraid we just don't understand that. So I wonder if you could send that to the data team.
So we know those systems. If you're interested in the version, yeah, just send a note to the eData team, and if they can provide that information, they will. I guess we'll do that one.
Yes.
I don't know. Which one? Oh, no, we didn't.
Okay, a question. How does a very small size sponsor, let's say 2 guys and a cell phone, get these data coordinated and combined with all of their CROs, including small labs that may have manual data?
Well, 2 guys with a cell phone perhaps shouldn't be doing clinical trials. Just my comment. So that's a business decision, how you're going to coordinate receipt of data and having the data in conformance with the standard when the standards are required. So I can appreciate there are a lot of small companies out there, but it's important that these data conform to the standards that we've laid out, so that as we've discussed and as Marianne, her opening remarks discussed, that eventually it provides for a more efficient review, higher quality data than 2 guys with a cell phone. No.
We're looking for others. I think we've gotten all of those.
The reason we're hesitating is that these questions are all embedded in, we have lost sound, we can't hear you, speak up. So we are going through each line.
A question here is, when is it mandatory to submit clinical data via ECTD? Well, ECTD is going to be a required submission standard too, so that will be coming, when that becomes final, I believe it's 24 months after that,
Right.
that the requirement will be to send your submissions in using ECTD, and the clinical data will just fit into the appropriate model in the ECTD. I think here we go. It looks like maybe one more. Non-clinical pharmacology studies generate data of types not anticipated by the standards. I think that we answered indirectly this one a little bit earlier to a similar question about endpoints that may not have any standards at that point. And I believe that the answer to that is to follow the standard as far as the standard will take you. And when there isn't any, then you would follow your own approach to sending that data, approach to submitting and packaging up that data, and just ensure that when you send in the submission that you have enough clarity around it that the reviewers understand what they're receiving. And I think we're right about at time, and it's looking like we've gone through, we think, most of these questions. Again, I apologize if we haven't gone through if we haven't gotten to your question. Please, if we haven't, send it back into us through the eData team. And again, we do intend to repeat this webinar later, and so hopefully if you don't have an answer by then, you could come and resubmit it, and we'll get to it then. Thank you.